Hi, I'm Kathleen Sabo of New Mexico Ethics Watch, and this is Ethics Now, conversation about ethics in everyday life. Our guest today is Hakim Bellamy. He is Albuquerque's inaugural poet laureate. He's a national and regional poetry slam champion, author, and musician. He is the father of a 12-year-old and a Kennedy Center Citizen Artist Fellow, a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Fellow, and soon to be a Covic Seminary Fellow. Welcome, Hakim.
How are you,
Hey,
Kathleen?
I'm well. Thanks for taking time out of what's got to be such a busy time for you. So really appreciate you being here on the program.
Yeah, I don't know if weekends exist anymore, Kathleen, but this feels like one, and we're having fun, so that makes it feel more like a weekend.
Good. All right, right, since there's nowhere much to go anyway.
Right.
Hey, so Hakim, you've had your hands and your heart in so much here in Albuquerque, in New Mexico, and beyond. And now you're working with the City of Albuquerque. How is that for you?
You know, I would say, like, on a personal level, it's interesting. It's one thing to be in the bureaucracy or in the government, or to be tapped to be in a decision-making position, in a position where you decide things for your community. And though my department, cultural services, is we like to consider ourselves more like the fun department and the art department, with respect to museums, the biopark, community events, Twinkle Light Parade, Summerfest, things like that. But to be in that position from an administrative perspective, and really just trying to drive, like just hold on to the wheel as a city government through a pandemic and through the movement for Black Lives, and then now with the current civil unrest, in our city, around 400 years of history. It's just like you barely signed up for the other thing, and now you're really doing this other thing that you didn't sign up for. So it's humbling. It's humbling to be in a leadership position in the community at this moment. But it's also very rewarding to be able to say, like, we are keeping people employed through the pandemic, which is no small thing. We're making sure people have health insurance through the pandemic, which is no small thing. And we're protecting the collections of the city. Like, we like to consider ourselves the collections department. And so the collections of art, the collections of animals, the collection of books, because libraries are in our department as well. And frankly, the collections of people, with our community and public event spaces, Chemo Theater, South Broadway, the things I mentioned, like the Twinkle Light and Summerfest, even though people aren't doing much collecting these days. But that, just to be in a position to say, hey, we're helping people support their families through this time, is something I don't get to do with poetry and poems. And so it's kind of a blessing to be able to do that at this time.
Well, and if people didn't know it before, they know from the introduction that you're quite an experienced and accomplished artist. And so today you and I are talking about the intersection of ethics and art and activism. And one thing we've been doing on this program when we get someone on, just to let people know, really where a guest is coming from, is have them talk a little bit about what ethics means to them, ethics as an artist or an activist. So if you take a moment and just talk about that for you, that'll help our listeners know where you're coming from.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like there's, let me think of the old me prior to 2.5 years ago when I was a full-time artist. When you mention ethics and arts, there's usually kind of like two trains of thought, two fields of thinking, right? There's like the ethics, like how are artists treated in society? How do we elevate or not elevate artists in our society? Are they more of a commodity, or are they really truly the reflection of the heart and soul of our society? And those are conversations that have been happening for a long time, right? A more recent conversation around ethics and arts tends to be about whether artists have a social responsibility to the moment, and what is it to be a political artist versus an artist of posterity, an artist of the canon, an artist of academia, what often means don't touch politics. Politics is the third rail, because politics are transient. If you write a poem today about the current president, it will be outdated. And so how do you talk about more universal issues like life, love, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? But then I remind people that those things, that quote is actually political. It's part of our political DNA. And so writing about those things, yes, is important. It's important as an artist to be your whole self in the world. But it's also, I personally feel, and this is where my colleagues might disagree, my creative colleagues might disagree, is that there certainly is a social responsibility to, if not write about the moment, because I'm a writer, to not run from the moment. And for me, I think that's really important to say, like, when you have something that feels real to say about the moment, even if you're not from my political ideology or bent or side of the aisle, that if that's inside you and pushing you and urging you, then it's meant to be shared with the world, because it's how we see ourselves. Like, we see ourselves through the arts. We see ourselves through, right now, a lot of us see ourselves through a screen, big or small, that is, streaming video, because we have nothing else to do in the pandemic. But that's art, commercial or independent or otherwise. It is art, and it has a huge say on the things that we do as far as policy in our society. If you need any reference for that, just look at the last general election. Like, the content that gets pushed through the social media channels, that gets pushed through the media channels, has a direct effect on how we govern and how we live. And so it's no small thing. And I think that's where the ethics of artists is, to know that responsibility is huge and it weighs heavy, and it's political to do it. And it's also a very political and intentional decision to not do it. And that's political as well.
Where do you come down on this question of whether artists are or ought to be a reflection of their community, or someone who's challenging the community, someone who's pushing boundaries? What are your thoughts on that, Hakim?
Well, the challenge, I mean, the difference between reflection and challenge kind of depends on what the politics are, right? So if my community is right of center and I'm left of center, now all of a sudden I'm challenging. If my government is left of center and I'm left of center, all of a sudden I'm reflecting. And so to understand that those things are subjective, just like I would argue reality is oftentimes subjective based on like the real material lived world. It's oftentimes, there's the multiverse, right? There's multiple ways of interpreting the world around us. And I just feel like that's where artists can find a compass. They can find a center. They can know what they know and share what they share. And it becomes, to me, it becomes most partisan when you're now trying to figure out what the wins are and trying to compensate and change your content as a result. That I'm not so much a fan of. But I do think that, like, just the act of creating in these times, right? Not just these times. When I say these times, I feel like it tends to couch in pandemic times, because that's all we've known for the past 3 months. But when I say these times, I mean like 2019, 2020, and the idea of making your own media, because that's what artists do. Artists are media makers, they're content makers, whether it's streamed on Netflix or not, whether it's streamed on iTunes or not. That is inherently political. Drawing attention to yourself, asking people to listen to you, is inherently political. And I just don't think as artists we should run from it. We should actually lean into that and know that, like, you have influence, and you may not have the power of professional athletes and politicians, but you do have a sphere of influence. And with that comes, as my mom says, and it's not unique to my mom, to whom much is given, much is required. And she's always reminding me, son, be careful. Like, don't be careful with your words because you're a poet. Because poets should be careful with their words. It's part of the job, is being intentional. But also be careful what you put out there, and give yourself grace and allow yourself to change your mind and admit you are wrong. Which are actually bigger superpowers than being able to write a cool poem.
So what does grace look like for you right now? I hope you're giving yourself grace. I hope we're all giving ourselves grace right now. What does that look like for you right now?
For me, it looks like sleeping, most times. I don't know. I've always been kind of a little bit of a nocturnal creature, because that's when I write. It's hard to write during the day when you're hustling a 9 to 5. And even before I went for the city, as hopefully most of our listeners well know, poets, becoming a poet is not necessarily a lucrative venture, but that, you know, you usually have to have a second job or a third job. You know, I taught before this. I was a teacher as well, which also inspired my writing in many ways, right? And so like that idea that I like to connect it directly to this moment and like the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. What does grace look like for me? It looks like me saying, you know what? I don't have to write every poem or the poem for the movement. I can actually step back and sit back and realize that what I'm doing on a different front is helping my community, and not just allow other voices, because there's always talented other voices, but really to say that like I don't have to feel the pressure to necessarily articulate for my community, which is actually part of the job when you're the poet laureate. Your job is to like, what's happening now, write about it,
Right,
like really
right.
commissions, like really contemporize, you know, your work and make it relevant to wherever we're asking you to write about, whether we're dedicating a building or whether we're, you know, talking about climate change. Like your job is to kind of produce a poem for the moment and for the city. But I don't have to do that anymore because I'm number one and we're about to crown number 5. And I can give myself some grace and I can step back and actually like, to be honest, figure out what I think a little bit more before I knee jerk and write. Because sometimes the thing that you write, well, oftentimes the thing you write first is not the thing. And you have to like live and feel a little more and, you know, let it cook a little more before you say the thing that's going to be as profound as you can be in that moment, you know?
Well, and you've been writing about what you call the movement for pretty much your whole life, isn't it? It's just part of your personal experience. And so do you have something, work that's out already that you'd like listeners to engage with that?
Yeah, it's hard, you know, Kathleen. I'll tell you what, like when I've generally talked about this moment as the third wave, but I may be incorrect because it might be wave number 4 of the Black Lives Matters movement, as the movement for Black lives. You know, we think about 2014, 2015, Trayvon Martin. We think about 2016, Mike Brown, and the associated hashtags vis-a-vis human lives that were attached to these spikes and these peaks in our vocal displeasure of how we are policed and governed. And then there was a little less in 2018, and now we're in 2020. In those moments, the struggle was to not write something that was just reflexive. I can do that whenever I want. Like I'm a writer, I journal. I have things that, you know, of all my body of work, you know, 15% of it is public. Most of it I do for me, right? I do for me to like get through, to get by, you know, without narcotics or harming other people. So it's very like, you know, it's very therapeutic, right? You know, but sometimes you think it's a thing that you think is worth sharing. You think it might give other people healing. You think it might give other people solace or give other people a window in to a different analysis or interpretation. And so you share it. And so I feel like in this moment, as it for me being like the 4th iteration, I've been a little bit more conservative, if you will, and just putting the pen to paper and trying to really figure out where I land and where I feel before I do that. I have a few pieces that I've shared. You know, one of the pieces that has gotten a little bit of traction was a piece I call Air Floyd. And I don't want to give it away because there's like, you know, I don't know, spoiler alert, but there's a reason it's called Air Floyd, you know, a la Air Jordan. And I Can't Breathe. Like that's not giving away too much, but the poem itself, you know, is going to be published in a journal called Writers Resist, and I was able to share it for a Juneteenth production done by Fusion Theater that I can point listeners to. And I've written a few things since, you know, more and less radical than that, right? Like more and less in your face than that, because I am trying to like kind of figure out, like, you know, it's tempting to say poets or have the pulse of the community. We don't. We're just kind of shooting in the dark until we hit it. And, you know, it might take 5 or 6 poems to figure out where it's at. And then when you find the right one, you try to share it in the spirit of evolving, in the spirit of being better, not in the spirit of being right. Because this is, you know, I hate to think that life, whether someone lives or dies, needs to be a political issue. I would hope it shouldn't be, but it is. And so.
You know, I'll share with you something about myself during this time. I've been a songwriter since I was 4 years old. And there's sometimes when things come up, a song about immigration will be like right there in the moment. But this, obviously my experience is different than yours during this time to a piece, but I'm in a pause as an artist myself. I've been pickaxing out in the backyard with a, trying to reclaim soil. That just something says, go pound rocks. Don't try to write a song right now. You're still incorporating
Yeah.
everything that's happening, so I
Still
understand.
receiving, still processing,
Yeah.
and that is a testament to the moment. Like it's bigger than I genuinely believe at this point. Not saying I believed this 6 weeks ago, or actually George Floyd was about 5 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I was kind of wait and see at the time as a Black man in this country to be like, is this going to be any different? Are we going to protest and make ourselves feel better and go home? But I feel like at this point, and seeing some systemic and policy change, not enough, but some, I'm a little bit more encouraged. But there's that internal churning kind of is like, it's a continual process. And when you tap into it to write, that's a snapshot. It kind of freezes whatever you feel at that moment in time. And sometimes you're just like, this is not the moment to take a picture. This is not the moment to make permanent the processing, right? To make permanent the deliberation and the feelings of it, So just like when you have a fight with your significant other, sometimes you're like, I shouldn't say that right now. So sometimes you're like, I shouldn't say that right now.
I want to memorialize that moment.
Right.
Well, are you seeing any, other artists, who maybe have, I don't know, don't feel the need to process or whatever decision they've made? Have you seen anyone else sort of stepping out during this time and making statements?
It's interesting because, I think the most profound statements I've been seeing have been not from music. Like I would say musicians are usually the vanguard of that. Like my fiance and I just got done watching, it's called Hitsville. I don't know if you are Showtime subscribers, but I encourage you to check out Hitsville. It's about the story of Motown, right? And it's got Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson, talking about what it meant to make songs in the 60s, right? And the pre-60s, right? And the intentional decision to move towards and away from the civil rights movement during those times, right? And so in the name of commerce, in the name of profit, right? And so I feel like those kind of go-to voices, like we're used to hearing like a John Legend speak out or a Marvin Gaye or a Common for hip hop. We're used to hearing certain artists be very vocal. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see them kind of even like they're probably vocal on their social media. I don't know who has time for social media these days, but I feel like they're not producing at the rate that they have in the past. And what you really see is like athletes who have historically been silenced. I mean, look at Colin Kaepernick. Look at John Williams and Tony Smith in 1968 Mexico City Olympics, and literally having their gold medal stripped. These folks that like athletes generally are like, we're doing well considering the circumstances. We're doing really well. Not doing as well as the owners. Definitely check out a book called $40 Million Slave, which makes a case for the emerging movement to pay college athletes, because a lot of people make money off of the TV of that March Madness and things that we love and watch, and those students barely get their college paid for. But like like there's definitely been a chokehold, for no pun intended, on athletes in this country, and to see them really coming out and exercising their power is significant. And to kind of see artists being like, we've always had the ability to make protests commodities and products because they were salable, and to see them actually be like, because it's kind of hard to record and make movies and do all those things right now in a pandemic, and really see kind of Black athletes step up is quite, it's interesting. It's something that's not getting necessarily enough attention around like this group that has historically been silenced, though, where generally I don't feel sorry for millionaires, but I'm glad these athletes are like, having the opportunity to speak out against billionaire bosses, right? And it's just really interesting. So, but as far as poets, there's a great group, and I'll have to send you the resource. There's a group of poets that I really admire who kind of became luminaries from the slam poetry scene, who I'm going to assume the content is in conversation with Black Lives Matter. I'm going to assume the conversation is in with the current movement. But because of the pandemic, what they did is they took to creating like a group of podcasts and Zooms online where they're just putting really progressive poetry out into the world, because the space didn't exist for them before. You know, they were all touring poets and they didn't get a chance to do that during the pandemic. So they kind of created a space where you can support artists, which is a good thing. It's a paywall. You pay to hear this content, but it also is, you know, those are the people I look up to. Those are the people who influence my work and have influenced my work for years. And so I'm happy to share that with our listeners.
And, you know, as I told you beforehand, we always post resources along with the show description. So listeners, I'll have that resource for you listed. So hopefully people will tune into that. So is there something that you see right now that could be the most ethical thing an artist could be doing right now? I mean, is it one size fits all, or does it just depend?
It's, you know, it's not one size fits all, you know, and I've had a conversation maybe a few weeks ago around my own career and my own trajectory as an artist. And so when I came here, almost 16 years ago, come January, you know, a lot of my rise as a poet, especially as a political poet, as a poet who wrote about current events, was through like rallies and protests. Like I remember reading poems in a Walmart parking lot at a protest against the war in Iraq, you know, and like, so these kind of things are like, would help public events and public gatherings, which we don't get a chance to do right now. Like we're a big part of building my own career, my own fan base, and finding people in the community who felt like they could connect to the things I care about, even though they didn't look like me, right? And so it was a huge part of beginning to build, you know, I just call it my community, but you know, some artists would call it a customer or fan base, because you know, we're commercialized, it's capitalism. But I, you know, I definitely say like, you know, my supporters, right? You know, and so that was a big part of me coming up as an artist, and not knowing many years later I'd be the poet laureate of the city, which also is a nod towards this kind of activist art, right? You know, and so it was like, yeah, that's the thing that connects to people. Great. I'm glad I can be that guy. I would hope that if I wasn't that guy, I wouldn't pander and just try to write those poems to build a following and a base, right? But I can say, like, you know, in this moment, and I don't know if it's you know, it's not one size fits all, but I can say in this moment there has been, you know, protests are happening even in the pandemic, and there are protests about Black lives. And the reality, my fiance and I have talked about this many times, is that if you ask me, a 42-year-old Black man, what I am more afraid of, COVID-19 or the police, I will say the police. So guess what? People are in the street, and they're kind of like, COVID-19, like I might get it, I might not. But I know that there is way more data and there's way more statistical certainty that I will meet my fate or maker at the hands of police. And so if I'm protesting to kind of end that system and there's a risk of getting COVID, you know, I'll choose my thing. I'll make my bets, you know what I'm saying? You know, I'll hedge my bets, if you will. And so like that's, in this moment, I feel like for artists, that's a good place for you to really find your people, to find your crowd, find the people who believe what you believe. That, you know, and I don't want to sit here and say, because I'm sure there are listeners who are like, well, poetry should be apolitical. And yeah, if it's a good poem, it hits you even if you don't agree with me, even if we don't share the same values. If it's a great poem about, you know, my cat or my dog, and, you know, we don't look alike, we didn't grow up alike, you still like the poem. And that's great if I'm trying to sell poems. But if I'm trying to survive as a human being, then I might be okay, as corporations are starting to come around too. And, you know, I'm not out here caping for corporations, but even them, you know, are starting to say, you know what, if we don't share the same values, I don't want you to buy my product. I don't want you to buy my book. Like, don't come to my store. Like, you know, if you can't see why people are in the streets protesting for their lives, and the only way for me to keep my like bottom line, or keep my like let's be real clear, to keep my shareholders content is to is like, we don't make a statement. We don't support Black Lives Matter. 4 years ago there was this big Blue Lives Matter movement, which you don't see as much right now, because that's been our own evolution, right? And to be able to say, like, actually, if you can't say that you believe why Black lives should persist, then maybe I don't want you to buy my book. Maybe I don't want you to show up at my reading, and that's just real, and so I just feel like that's going to be a shift for artists to kind of then be like, okay, so now we went from just marketing to values marketing. And it's not new. Like, Apple's been doing that forever, right? Like, to be able to be like, find the people who share your values, and they'll be enough. Like, you don't have to conquer the whole world. You don't have to be Walmart or Pepsi or Coke, but you could be okay with a little bit less if you connect to people's values. And I think that's the thing for artists right now. And they're doing it. And they're doing it in their social media because they can't perform. They're finding people who really care about what they care about. And it might be less customers, because somebody will be mad that you supported X, or somebody will be mad that you supported Y, but the customers that you do keep will be like loyalists. And that's okay. I feel like that's okay. And that's my message to artists right now.
And one encouraging thing we're seeing, Hakim, is institutions that we thought would never, and maybe, and I don't want to be so suspect of their motives to think that there's not some authenticity, like sure. The NFL, like all of a sudden, sure, go ahead, Neil, we support you, whereas it was, right. There was this, hard and fast, we're not going to tolerate this. And we see certain owners speaking out and others don't. And I think that's very telling at this point. But it is a check. I mean, it's a time for a check on so many things. And boy, I'm sure hoping a time to heal divisiveness,
I hope so. And that's where, we've, in this country, there's definitely been I've been reading a great book that I want to share with the readers, and I'll put it in the resources. It's called White Trash, The Untold 400-Year History of Class in America. Nancy Eisenberg is the author. And, she begins at the very beginning about like how we created race, how we created striations of race, particularly for white folks in this country, and how, corporate good and corporate profit was the driving motivator in all of that. And so to see that sector come around, that was all about centralizing wealth and all about centralizing commerce, and to kind of also say, to your point, we're going to support these athletes because A, they're our workers, we have no team without them. And B, if it means we lose some fans or customers, that's fine. We'll be okay. Our profit margin is such that losing 10% of people to support 90% of our labor force actually is a good business decision. And that's it's equally incredible. And how come it took us this long? How is it incredible and how is it cool?
Absolutely. Like when we look at NASCAR too, and
right.
Bubba Wallace making a request for the Confederate flag to be banned, and everything that's come down since then. But maybe and maybe them just deciding this is the right thing to do as well.
The right thing to do, and it's the right time. We can't let that pass, right? It's also the right time, and I feel like that's why power. And I'm totally paraphrasing Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois, but power is going to perpetuate itself. It's going to perpetuate itself until it's forced to do something different. And that's what's happening. It's being forced to do something different. And it is the power of the purse and the power of the dollar. It's the power of boycotts. It's the power of spending with your values, right? And them losing, frankly, they don't have any content. When we look at the NBA, I'm a fan of what the NBA has done as opposed to what the NFL has done. Kaepernick is the poster child for the NFL not acting fast enough. The NBA was a little bit better at supporting its players. Yep. But at the same time, you're just there's some, corporate expediency in the moment to kind of say, we actually aren't producing any content. There's no games happening. There's no movies being made. And so we're kind of in triage. And how do we not shrink our customer base in a moment where we can't grow them? Right. And so they and all that matters, because what that does is that gives leverage to the movement and the protest to kind of say, well, now is the time to really make them change course, because normally they just, throw more content at us, more games and more games with players wearing shirts and bands that say Black Lives Matter, and that would be enough, and we'd be happy and we'd go home. But they're like, no, we have to do more, because actually, up until 2 weeks ago, we actually have no new content to keep the fish on the hook, right? To keep the fish on the hook, right?
Right.
So.
Well, so we've talked about some leagues and businesses evolving, and I know you're in a time of giving yourself grace right now, but how do you see yourself evolving in the near future or even beyond?
The main thing I've seen, Kathleen, is that with my personal life, with my family, being working from home, we've all done it. We've all had to do it. Being figuring out a way to be present while still being productive. And I don't want to hang my hat on productivity. You've seen a lot of chatter out here around nobody has to be the hero of the pandemic. Frankly, I've taken to describing the pandemic as a time of collective grief, that there is a grieving of what we used to be able to do. There's a grieving to having lost spring and now losing summer. There's a grieving that's happening like collectively, but being able to within that also be able to say I don't have to be a superhero at work right now. I am blessed to be able to get a paycheck, but there's still psychosomatic ramifications of the death count in this country and the death count worldwide, right? And so there's real grief, and so I think what I've learned, especially as a political artist, is to kind of sit in that, to kind of be reckon with that, feel that, be in a different way, and I already consider myself an empath of sorts, but it's just no, that's a staggering statistic and a staggering fact, and sometimes you just go home and take care of your people. You don't have to be everything to everybody. You just go home and take care of your people, because your people need taken care of, right? And so I think that's my evolution because of this moment. It's also my evolution because I just turned 42, and your 40s are different than your 30s, right? You have a little bit of permission to be a little bit more selfish in that regard, but it's not selfish for selfishness' sake. It's saying it's one thing to be a caretaker for your community, and don't do that at the expense of being a caretaker for your immediate, your immediate family, right? Because otherwise it's an exercise in ego and you're a hypocrite. So that for me is a personal learning from all what's going on. But I think a broader learning too is just about how much, how dependent we are, how dependent we have been up into this moment on our list of things that we do to define the list of things that we are, right? And so a lot of that for people who have been able to work through the pandemic, they're blessed, they're privileged. To some extent, we could argue that essential workers aren't privileged to work through the pandemic, but to be able to get a paycheck in a pandemic is an amazing thing with record unemployment, right? It's an amazing thing. You can't not say that. But to also say, I was driving all these miles over the city, killing the planet to do all these things that I felt like I had to do. And guess what? I didn't have to do them. I chose to do them, right? And that kind of reckoning of how do you, as we begin to open up safely, which I'm not saying that we're doing right now, but as we move more towards the future and the eventual vaccine and the eventual moving on to the next thing, how do we reset the table? Do we all reset our chips in a way that's a little bit more holistic? We've all learned how to work from home. Will our employers say, you know what, as opposed to being the chaperone of the time clock and making sure you're in this office 40 days a week, that actually you could get it done in 20 and maybe you could stay home. I feel like those things are our collective kind of reckoning from this moment. And maybe the virus is teaching us something.
One thing I say is one of the worst things about this time is it's probably going to last a while. But one of the best things about this time, because it's a time where we can choose to give ourselves grace and reset the table and move our chips around, is that we have some time. We have some time to work it out. And I'm glad to hear that that's what you're doing as an artist, as an individual, and, a person that the community has listened to and looked up to and learned from. So that's all good.
I've been blessed. I feel like I moved here almost 16 years ago, and the city like just like put me on their shoulders and paraded me through the street. And I'm like, I hope I can live up to it, and I'm still like, I kind of, that's always in the back of my mind. It's like a chip on my shoulder. Like, this city has given me so much. Like, it's given me a career, like, frankly, like, through winning the National Poetry Slam in 2005, and just being invited to, I've often kind of conceptualized it and shared it as like, the grace this city has given me is that it's not just given me opportunity, but it's put me in positions to prove myself. And they've been okay with when I failed. They've frankly been okay with when I failed, because they're like, that's what you need to do to grow, And so like, I feel like I've just been given this kind of a little bit extra rope, as an artist and as a community member. I don't even like to use the word community leader. I feel like, I organized, in the past, but it's just like, they've definitely had a lot of grace around, like, the only way you're going to do this job well is if, you try it. And if you try it and you're not good at it, we'll still let you try something else, kid. And like, and I feel like that's kind of been Albuquerque's approach with me. And then eventually you'll find your thing. They didn't ostracize me or exercise me for not getting it right the first time. And that's allowed me to really, have a career in many different ways in this town, and in fact serve this town in many different ways. So,
well, we'll certainly be looking forward in the future to see how, what your art is, what that's, and what this time has brought out in you, and then what your service is to people as well. But I want to give you an opportunity to say anything that you'd like to our listeners in closing, Hakim.
I feel like I love what you're doing, Kathleen, and I've said that to you. I think that ethics is such a, as we would say, I'm East Coast, so I'm thinking about like my mom and my parents, my dad, a highfalutin word. Like, ethics feels so heavy. It feels like a heavy word, but we all practice it. We all practice it every day, right? Like, we practice it with the people that we live with. We practice it in how we tip or don't tip. We practice it in so many ways. And yeah, sure, it rises to the level of like civil rights law and human rights law. Often it rises to the level of, holding governments and corporations and people in power accountable. Whenever you go to the doctor, there's an ethical code, right? There's an ethical code. If you get a coronavirus test, there's an ethical code in what they have to tell you, what they should be telling you, what they can and can't do. And so I just feel like this is, it's exciting to be part of this and what you're doing, because I feel like it's hopefully it brings that word down a few notches so that we aren't so afraid of it. I mean, with the current movement to change policing is talking about, just more accountability. And that's it, like more accountability. Like, now, yes, there are folks calling for defund. I've been calling for refund. Like, if it ain't working for people, give them their money back and let them do something else with it. But that same accountability that you would have if, someone sold you a bad lawnmower, that's what we're asking for in the highest levels of power and the highest level of service, community servants, which is what our government is. And which is what corporations should be doing, And so I just feel like this goes a long way in helping to demystify that and help people understand that. Like, I'm just a poet, and we've just spent an hour talking about what ethics means in my line of work. So if you're a teacher, man, that's a little bit heavier. If you are like, if you are a printmaker, what are you printing and what are you not printing? Those are ethical decisions, If you are a retailer, what are you selling and where are you buying it for? And what happens to the people where you buy it? And is that worth your greater or lesser profit margin? Like, those things are critical ethical questions, and we're all doing it. So I appreciate this, and I think there should be more of it.
Well, and one of the things that's connected me to your work, Hakim, has always been your authenticity. And I'd certainly stick my neck out to say that that's something that a lot of people have found connected them to your work. And again, today, here you are just being yourself and being willing to share your thoughts and ideas and reflections. So thank you. Thank you for your time today. And thank you for your authentic heart and being. Really appreciate it.
Thank
So
you.
thanks to our guest, Hakim Bellamy, for joining us today. If you'd like to suggest topics or guests for Ethics Now, please visit our New Mexico Ethics Watch Facebook page or email us at ethicsnowshow@gmail.com. You can listen to every Ethics Now episode at ethicsnow.org and on all major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Ethics Now. Thanks, Hakim. Be well.
Thank you, Kathleen.